And I think that we should note that the comments that Bibi Netanyahu and Lerman and others have been making in answer to anti-Semitism, this perceived rising anti-Semitism in Europe, is not to encourage Jews to combat it where they live, but to escape, to flee, to run away from it to Israel. Now, this classic Zionist answer has been at the root of Israeli state policy from 1948. When the state was founded, Israel took upon itself the role of protector of the communities, Jewish communities throughout the world, of the Jewish faith, and of the demographic viability of the nation, which meant that Israel would save Jews, but individually and as groups in the context of the Zionist vision, in other words, by aliyah, not by going to fight anti-Semitism if it occurred where it was. It was a founding myth of Zionism, after all, that it would eliminate anti-Semitism. That was one of the aims of Zionism. So how else could they deal with the problem but to present the Zionist answer, which is aliyah, immigration? To help communities fight it would have meant believing that those communities would have a future when the weakness of diaspora communities and the negation of the diaspora was so essential to what Zionism was all about. As David Ben-Gurion, a significant figure in Israel's early history and prehistory, put it, and I quote, "We have to consider the interests of diaspora Jewry, but not what they think of their interests, but what we regard as their interests. If it was a case vital for Israel, and the interests of Jews concerned were different, the vital interests of Israel come first, because Israel is vital for world Jewry." And it was on this basis that Israel's foreign policy was conducted when it came to questions of anti-Semitism in certain countries. So, for example, Israel's relations with Argentina and South Africa during the time when Argentina was under generals and South Africa was under apartheid. And Jews in both of those countries were suffering because many of them were on the left and they were opposing the regimes. It would have been possible for Israel to have a policy which supported those Jewish communities in that situation, but they sold arms to those countries while Jews in those countries suffered. Take Austria, when the right-wing party in Austria, the mainstream right-wing party, went into coalition with the Freedom Party, the neo-fascists, or the former neo-fascists led by Haider, was it 10 years ago or 12 years ago, something like that. Israel went along and supported the kind of boycott that the European Union imposed on the Austrian government. It was a very mild boycott, as it happened. At the same time, they did nothing about the Italian neo-fascist party headed by Fini going into government there. They kept quiet about it because that government promised to take a more pro-Israel line than it had heretofore. And another example, again related to Austria and Waldheim, the Waldheim affair. You know about this, but the former Secretary General of the United Nations, who was unmasked as having been, well, not exactly a Nazi war criminal, but something close to it, unmasked at the time in the 80s by the World Jewish Congress, and Israel very strongly objected to the World Jewish Congress campaign on this because of its relations with the Austrian government, which it felt were more important. So we can see that anti-Semitism and what Jews are suffering was not necessarily something that Israel was reflecting in its foreign policy. Now, this classic Zionist position lasted until the 1980s, when there was a major policy change. A change to what people who write about this call the strategy of insecurity in Israeli hegemony. Israel kept out of public involvement in the fight against anti-Semitism around the world, but all this changed with growing international opposition to Israeli policies in the 70s and 80s, linked to the rise of the Palestinian national movement and the campaigns of terror against Jewish and Israeli targets abroad. At this time, Israel felt that it had to respond. So it decided at some point in the 1980s to make a change, to play a more public international role in the monitoring and the research and action against anti-Semitism worldwide, stressing that they're doing this because of their sense that Jews were vulnerable and facing an insecure situation, if not today, then tomorrow at some point in the future. And you had some important statements by key Israeli figures, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin saying, fighting anti-Semitism is Israel's obligation due to the Holocaust experience. The government secretary Eliakim Rubinstein in 1995 saying, combating anti-Semitism is Israel's duty. So there was a clear change of policy and a very public one as well in some ways. The tools for this new policy were the Israel government monitoring forum on anti-Semitism that was set up, the Mossad, acting mostly through Israeli embassies abroad, and the establishment of a research center at Tel Aviv University, which at the time was called the Project for the Study of Anti-Semitism. Now, many Jewish communities who were sort of dragged into this were very ambivalent about this, as were many of the monitoring bodies in Jewish communities in those countries. This is actually where this larger story that I'm trying to tell intersects with my own personal story, because at this time, the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, I was just taking over as the director of the Institute of Jewish Affairs, which was the London-based research arm of the World Jewish Congress. And one of the main things that we started to do, this was after '89, after the collapse of communism, from 1990 to 1991, was to monitor what was seen to be an upsurge of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe as a result of the collapse of communism. I don't know whether anyone remember, there's certainly people here old enough to remember this, but whether they do remember this, I don't know. But there was a huge international conference in Brussels on combating anti-Semitism, organized by the World Jewish Congress in 1992. Presidents, prime ministers, Jesse Jackson was there, a whole host of figures. And one of the things that I initiated at the Institute of Jewish Affairs was an annual survey of anti-Semitism. There wasn't such a thing until then. A country-by-country, human rights style report. For most of the 1990s, a battle went on between us, involving the Mossad, involving Jewish research and defense groups, the World Jewish Congress, the major American Jewish organizations with international outreach like the American Jewish Committee, the ADL, the Wiesenthal Center, over who should produce this report. Because some people thought that we shouldn't be doing it, and they thought that they should be doing it. This new center at Tel Aviv, for example. And because this report had become, well, significant, and it was a battle about who should control the international Jewish narrative on the problem of anti-Semitism, where Israel was trying to exert hegemony over that story and tell it itself. Now, we at what was then the Institute of Jewish Affairs stood out for independence. This was a period, actually, in the 90s when anti-Semitism was diminishing. There was a scare about Eastern Europe, but at the end of the day, things settled, they went up and down. And we insisted on telling the story as we found it through all our collections around the world. But Israel didn't like it. Mossad didn't like it. We didn't want Israeli Zionist involvement in what we were doing because we thought it would damage what we were doing. We would seem to be biased. And also the Israelis had their own data. They were kind of collecting their own data. And the data that they were using and they wanted everybody to use was appalling. It was extremely weak. And they almost inevitably interpreted that data in the worst possible light. So seeing anti-Semitism always, even when there wasn't any. What was most disturbing to us, though, was that we found out that the Tel Aviv Center was actually being funded by the Mossad. It was, for a while, literally kind of front organization for them. And quite soon they tried to separate themselves from that connection because they themselves realized, Tel Aviv, that it would damage their own reputation if they were seen to have this financial connection. And what also emerged was that Mossad was basically using the data that it collected and the Tel Aviv University's data collection as a crude recruiting tool for Zionism and Aliyah. They had their own connections to individuals in Jewish communities worldwide, often young people in isolated communities who they contacted and said, send us information about anti-Semitism, basically kind of agitating, getting them worried, getting them concerned about this problem as a means of kind of encouraging the Zionist idea. Mossad didn't like what we were doing. I won't go into this here. They tried to frame us. It didn't work. But I have to say, sadly, that by the end of the 1990s, this battle that we were waging over the report we were producing, we lost. It was a source of great sadness for me, because it seemed to me that one of the voices that was saying, talking objectively about anti-Semitism, was effectively being silenced. Now, whether one can say the Israelis won is not quite so clear, because actually they reversed this policy for a while, following the Oslo Accords, because it wasn't in their interests to be making a fuss about anti-Semitism when they were making peace with the Palestinians. But what happened during these years was that others adopted this insecurity agenda wholeheartedly, especially the powerful American Jewish organizations, the ADL and the AJC. The ADL was, I think, along that kind of line, but the AJC wasn't so much, but it became more and more like that during the 1990s. I know that very well because for a while we had, the Institute of Jewish Affairs had a formal relationship with the American Jewish Committee. It didn't last very long, and ended in acrimony. And what also happened was that the new orthodoxy about the main threat from anti-Semitism had become, by this time, the end of the 90s, widely adopted, and that is the notion of the new anti-Semitism. Irrespective of what has happened since the end of the century, it should already be clear from what I've said that Israel has played a deeply problematic role, one that poses a very serious challenge to diaspora, to Jews. So let's come now to the question of anti-Semitism today.